You've had a long federal career, 40 plus years. Why did you pursue a career in government?
It's kind of an interesting story. My father worked for the government for many years. I was in graduate school at the time. He told me, son, why don't you take the professional career examination and think about working for government? I said, I don't want to work for government, Dad. I really don't. He kept bugging me and bugging me and bugging me. So over the years, I ignored him, and then he said, did you take that test yet? And I said, no. I did actually sign up because I love my father. He was a great man and really influenced my life. I took the exam. At the time, I was in graduate school at Old Dominion University, trying to earn my master's in public administration, thinking someday I'm going to be a city manager or something of that nature. And I got a call from the Department of the Navy saying that they want to interview me through that PACE exam for a position as a personnel management specialist at the shipyard, Norfolk Naval Shipyard. Well, at the time I was on a $5,000 research assistantship, living in a little rat-infested place near Old Dominion University. And I said, how much does that pay? And they said, $12,000 a year. And I said, I'm still in graduate school. Can I take graduate courses, and will you be interested in paying for those? Oh, yes, we can do that. I said, sign me up. So that's how I became a government employee. I honestly had no intention of being a government employee until that opportunity came up. And as it turns out, you know, in my mind, I was going to do that for a little while and then go back to the private sector. Never turned out that way. I ended up with a 42-year career in the government.
After 15 years as an advocate, representative for management, what led you to becoming a commissioner with Federal Mediation and Conciliation Service?
Well, as I mentioned, I was a labor relations type for the Department of the Navy. I used to represent management at the collective bargaining table in arbitration cases, all different kinds of advocacy, and I enjoyed doing that work. But in doing that work, I got to meet an FMCS commissioner because we did need mediation when we were working with the 9 unions that I had dealt with at the Norfolk Naval Shipyard. And the commissioner was a really nice guy who did an excellent job, and I asked him a little bit about the position, and he told me that I had the temperament that might fit well at FMCS. And he was kind of getting near the end of his career, and I had mentioned that I might be interested in that someday. I ended up leaving the shipyard after 5 years and became the head of labor relations at the naval base in Norfolk. And I did that for a while, and then I became the labor relations advisor for Navy headquarters. And then that individual ended up retiring. And he asked me to apply for the position. At the time, it was actually a pay cut to come back to work for come to work for FMCS and leave my advocacy position. But I liked that kind of work so much, trying to get labor and management to work things out and get a deal, that I took a change to lower grade to come to work as a commissioner for FMCS because I thought the mission of FMCS was very noble. It served both labor and management, and I preferred that over the advocacy work, which mostly turned out to be kind of win-lose work. I thought I was pretty good at winning, but after a while, sometimes you felt bad about winning some cases that you did win. So I liked the role of becoming a neutral in the labor management community, and I started doing that after 15 years of being an advocate, and I really enjoyed it. I enjoyed being a field mediator.
Speaking of that, you've held a lot of positions at FMCS. You're beginning with a commissioner, you became the special assistant to the director, you were the director of international affairs, the ADR senior mediator, and then you became the deputy director and ultimately the director. What experiences you could share with us for the 26 years that you were at FMCS?
Well, being a commissioner was an interesting experience. FMCS, again, as I mentioned earlier, is a noble role. Our role is to work with labor and management and be a neutral. I was a former advocate for management, so the first thing that really kind of hit me was I needed to maintain my neutrality and make sure that all of my past experiences representing management were wiped from my memory. It takes a lot of time for our former advocates to morph into that role as a neutral. And I did that for a number of years, and I became relatively good at it. At times it was difficult because you feel for either side of the collective bargaining table at times. But in general terms, I really enjoyed being a field mediator. Now, shortly after the beginning of my career, for some reason, the director, Richard Barnes, decided in 1998, only 3 years into my time at FMCS, to appoint me as special assistant to the director. So I had the opportunity to come up to Washington, D.C. during the Clinton administration and act as a key advisor to the director. So I get to learn a lot about the running of the agency and some of the major projects that the agency was involved in. Shortly after getting that assignment, I was also given the responsibilities of running our international and ADR programs, which was really an exciting experience. I'll touch on some of those experiences a little bit later in our discussion, but it took me kind of out of the domestic world into the international world, and I got to learn an awful lot about labor relations all over the world, how it works, and actually how to help some nations set up labor relations systems that were somewhat similar to ours, and we were able to transfer some of that knowledge to a lot of different nations. And I enjoy that work, and I really relish that work and the responsibilities I was given at FMCS to do that kind of work. Eventually, I was having some issues with my youngest child, Joey. And I actually asked the director at the time, Peter Herkin, who followed Director Barnes, that I go back to the field because I was assigned up here in Washington. I was going back and forth to where I live in the Virginia Beach area. And I asked to go back as a senior mediator because I wanted to be closer to, raise my son. And I was gone the entire week when I was up in Washington. That was an interesting experience going back to the field and, again, working with the parties again. Again, it's the best job in the agency, in all honesty, and I've held just about every position there is at FMCS. I enjoyed working with the parties. I worked with companies like Newport News Shipbuilding and Dry Dock Company. I worked with the Virginia Symphony Orchestra. Talk about two different experiences. Those two industries are about as different as it can be. And I got to learn about what they do for a living. I got to learn the inner workings of those organizations. I got to learn about the employees' experiences at both of those kinds of organizations. So I really enjoyed doing that work an awful lot. I thought I'd pretty much end my career as a field mediator, perfectly happy, and then I received a strange phone call saying, would you be interested in potentially being the director of FMCS? And that's a story I'll tell a little bit later.
You spoke of being the director of international affairs for FMCS. Can you expand on that a little bit? Can you talk about some of the biggest projects you worked on and how that helped host agencies and
Sure.
host countries?
Sure. There's two projects that were really exciting. I literally traveled to 24 separate nations and did different programs, different places. But the main program that I like to talk about is our work in Panama. The Republic of Panama was obviously where the Panama Canal was. At the time, when I was first assigned to work with the Panama Canal and their unions, it was a U.S. government agency called the Panama Canal Commission. President Carter signed a treaty in 1978, which was leading to the transfer of the canal to the Republic of Panama in the year 2000. Going from a U.S. government agency with 10,000 employees and 5 separate unions to a Panamanian entity on December 31st at 12 noon in 1999, our flag came down, their flag went up. It took a lot of work to get there. And a lot of work started with the workforce. and management of the canal and the government of Panama. And I was given the assignment of being the lead mediator in dealing with the transition of the Panama Canal from a U.S. entity to a Panamanian entity in the year 2000. So I literally spent on and off 5 years of my life kind of living in Panama, working with the 5 unions, the management of the Panama Canal Commission, to establish kind of working practices and even establish the mediation service, the labor statute that would follow the employees and the commission into the future. So it was an exciting role. I enjoyed doing that. I learned to speak Spanish when I was there. And I can say now that the Panama Canal has to this day not had any labor disputes that have come as a result of labor and management not getting along at the Panama Canal. That was a big worry when the canal was going to be transferred to the Republic of Panama. Would they be able to have peaceful labor relations? And the work we did, it wasn't just me, there was a cadre of mediators from FMCS who worked along with me down there to help train people in dispute resolution techniques, to help establish their mediation system, to establish their labor code. A lot of work was done by FMCS, funded by USAID, to make sure the Panama Canal remained a key highway for basically the world's customers. And I'm very proud of that work that FMCS did. One of the most interesting parts of my work in Panama, and the part that's closest to my heart, is that I met my wife in Panama. She worked for the Panama Canal Commission. She was their administrative assistant, and absolutely fell in love with her. For some unknown reason, she fell in love with me, and we've been married for 22 years ever since. The lovely Miss Mara was one of the other part of my work in Panama that I am very proud of. We are happily married, and I took a little piece of Panama home with me when that project was over.
Continuing your FMCS career, you were ultimately promoted to the deputy director, and then you were nominated by President Trump and were confirmed by the Senate to become the director of FMCS. And that was a great time of change in the agency from 2018 to 2021. Can you talk about the changes within FMCS and what experiences you undertook at the agency?
Sure. Well, let me start with just the phone call that I got. You know, I'm a field mediator. I've been a field mediator. I had a decent reputation. I became a senior mediator, so I was traveling throughout the country, not just handling cases in the Virginia area. I was traveling all over the country doing symphony cases and lots of difficult cases. But again, I thought my career was, you know, going to be coming to an end. I was happy being a field mediator, loved doing that work. And then I got a phone call from a friend who knew some folks in the administration who said to me, "Would you be interested in being the director of FMCS?" And I have to be honest with you. I said, "Get out of here." I said, "No one's going to be interested in me as the director of FMCS. I'm not politically connected whatsoever. You know, I've been a commissioner with the agency for forever, but you know, I don't contribute to any campaign. That's not who I am. Not even allowed to under, you know, government rules." So I said, "No, I'm serious. Would you be interested if I float your name up there?" I said, "Yeah, sure." So, you know, I honestly thought the guy was pulling my leg. So the next thing I know, I get an email from the White House Personnel Office saying, we're looking for a director of FMCS. Would you be interested?" In all honesty, I thought I was being pranked by my friend. I really thought he sent me a prank email. So I looked up the White House Personnel Office. I looked to see if that name was real, and it turned out to be real. And I answered that email. I said, yes, I'd be interested. I sent them a bunch of information. Before I know it, I'm being interviewed for the first time at the White House. in 2017. Then apparently I did well enough to be interviewed a second time at the White House. And then I waited for a long time. As it turns out, I didn't get the nomination, somebody else did. But as it turns out, that person, they never acted on his nomination. Then I got a call from the White House and they said, would you be interested in being acting director? I said, sure. Next thing I know, I'm up in Washington as the acting director of the agency, surprising a lot of people in the agency because, obviously, I really hadn't pined for the position. I'd never lobbied for the position. Didn't tell anybody I was even being considered for the position. So I came up here. I became director. Then eventually they decided to nominate me, and then I went through the process and eventually was confirmed. And there's another story associated with that as the 19th director of FMCS. So the experience of getting to become the director was quite an experience. As far as the changes that went on, I came in 2018, in June of 2018, as the acting director. And it was before the pandemic hit. But what was really interesting about the pandemic was we were prepared for it because we started to move to being more technically savvy, the ability to do training programs using our video capabilities and the like. We started using Zoom platforms and things like that way before the pandemic hit. Once the pandemic hit, we were pretty good at it. Matter of fact, we were kind of out of the gate a lot faster than a lot of federal agencies in our ability to serve our customers using, the video technology. So that was exciting. It was difficult though because, mediation is a face-to-face kind of job, and all of a sudden we had to do it via technology, and it took a lot of training for our workforce, all of our mediators out in the field, some of whom were not all that technically savvy to learn the new ways of doing business. So we had a real challenge to get from point A, the beginning of the pandemic, to truly serving our customers. And I have to give a lot of credit to our the current nominee for the position of director, who's still unfortunately not been confirmed, Javier Ramirez, who kind of led that evolution from being a face-to-face agency to an agency that was capable of working with our customers via Zoom and other video platforms.
Well, you retired from FMCS in 2021, but you remained active in labor relations. What have you been doing since your retirement?
Well, for 6 months, I played golf every single day. I found out that playing 7 days a week becomes almost like a job. Even though I love the game of golf, it was a little bit too much for me. But I got that golf bug out of me. Now I play 4 days a week, which is just about the right balance. But more importantly, to answer your question, I am the executive director of the Society of Federal Labor Employee Relations Professionals. So I stay connected to that membership organization, which focuses on labor relations in the federal sector. I run conferences for that organization, and that keeps me, again, connected to the federal sector side. I'm also an arbitrator on the FMCS roster, and I've had an opportunity to arbitrate a number of cases since leaving FMCS in 2021. I tend to get a lot of federal sector cases because I obviously ran a federal agency. I understand the federal system, and arbitrating in the federal sector is very, very different than arbitrating in the private sector. I've had some private sector cases. I have to admit, I really don't like the role of arbitrator as much as I did the role of mediator. I like much more being a peacemaker than a decision maker when it comes to a situation where you've got to make a call on who you believe, one side or the other. That's difficult. And it's also difficult to put it all down in writing and not hurt anybody's feelings in the process. It's kind of part of what an arbitrator does. It says, you win, you lose, but let's still continue to work well together, so you're very careful in how you write your decision. I much more prefer the put my arms around both sides and get them to work things out on their own. But again, that's not my role anymore. Now I'm an arbitrator, so I'm getting more and more comfortable in that world. Again, I play golf 4 days a week, so I try to keep fit and in good shape. And I have to actually use my mediation skills on the golf course a lot when it comes to, paying off the bets and things like that at the end of a round. So I still practice some of those skills with my group when I play golf.
I'd like to hear about Jerry Barrett and Friends of FMCS. Can you tell me a little bit about him and the organization he started?
Jerry Barrett, who is the father of the Friends of FMCS, had a true passion for the history of FMCS. Now, most agencies really, they don't have a historian. It's not a position in the OPM manual of historian of an agency. So Jerry decided that the history of FMCS needs to be kind of written, cataloged, and collected. And he had done this dating way back to his beginning days with FMCS in the early 60s. He was hired as a commissioner way back when. When he was in that internship going through his learning process, he did a detail, I believe, at the Department of Labor and was pretty much told to go to the library at the Department of Labor and do some research there. And he kind of got the bug for research and collect a lot of information about FMCS when it was originally in the Department of Labor. A lot of folks don't know this, but FMCS really started in the early 1800s as part of the Department of Labor. There was a cadre of commissioners who were Department of Labor employees who focused solely on getting the parties together and mediating their labor disputes. Now, in 1947, the Taft-Hartley Act was passed and pulled that role out of the Department of Labor. The reason given for separating the FMCS function from the Department of Labor was the perception that Department of Labor had a bit of a union leaning as opposed to being a neutral agency. Whether that's true or not, it's, debatable. But the reality is in 1947, FMCS was taken out as an independent agency and reports directly to the president. Jerry, while he was at the Department of Labor, gathered as much information as he could about the early days of those commissioners with the Department of Labor, who all came over and started the very beginning of the FMCS, which was located in a number of different locations. I believe they were still physically in the Department of Labor building for a while, and then eventually given their own building on 21st and K Street. But Jerry's history goes way back to then, to the beginnings of the FMCS in 1947, and the trail of information, which he thought was very interesting. And in retrospect, I'm glad he did it, because he collected information that probably would have been lost to time, but for Jerry's interest in all that. So then, Jerry becomes a mediator. He becomes a key player in the training department of FMCS, and continues to collect all the information associated with the history of the organization. Eventually, he leaves FMCS, starts his own arbitration practice, still has an interest in FMCS, and continues to connect with mediators in the field. Anytime new technology comes out and old technology is thrown away, he asks for that information to be sent to him, and he starts this collection. When I was first with FMCS in 1995, he kind of formalizes the whole Friends of FMCS Foundation. It becomes a nonprofit. He starts collecting donations to house the collection, which now has 250 some boxes, which are now housed in George Washington University's collection. But he was holding all of that at the time and storing it and collecting it and parading it out every now and then when people asked about the history of FMCS. Now, the evolution of the Friends of FMCS History Foundation and Jerry and the actual FMCS, the organization, is also an interesting story. There were some directors that were very supportive of what Jerry was doing, and there were some that were not so supportive of what Jerry was doing. Again, there's not an official position of historian of FMCS. So he didn't always receive the most cooperation from some of the former directors of FMCS. When I became director, I invited Jerry to come to this very office, and I spent 2 hours talking to him and giving him an opportunity to tell me more about the Friends of FMCS History Foundation. He was happy to do that. He was happy that he was even invited here, because in the past he said he wasn't quite as welcome as he had hoped he would be. On top of the fact that I welcomed him, I offered him an opportunity to speak to our new mediators. And because his history, I thought, was very important to FMCS. So he actually spoke to our new mediator classes and told them about the History Foundation and about all the information that he'd collected over the years. And again, I became a big supporter. Jerry, unfortunately, passed away the year I retired. And I was on the mailing list for the Friends, and some of the folks on the board of directors said, we need somebody to run the Friends of FMCS History Foundation. I had just retired. No one else volunteered. So I said, I'll take over the website. I'll take over the role of sending out the emails kind of about FMCS and what's going on now. And I took on that role in 2021. So that's kind of how I took over Jerry's role as the unofficial historian of FMCS History Foundation. I still keep the website up. I add new articles to it. The agency works with me and gives me information on who's retiring, big projects they're involved in, and many former mediators appreciate staying in touch with the agency. And some researchers use that information to write papers and the like about collective bargaining in our country. So it's a role I didn't expect to take on. No one else wanted to do it. But in all honesty, I'm enjoying doing it. I'm enjoying keeping the history of the agency out there. And I love this agency, FMCS, and I thought I owed them that because it is a good, noble agency that has a great mission.
Speaking of that, you've held almost every position in this agency. What do you think the future of FMCS is?
I think the future of FMCS is solid if it adjusts with society and what's going on in collective bargaining in our country. This is a dispute resolution agency with highly skilled dispute resolution professionals. The early days of FMCS, it was all about labor relations. And that's when unionization was in a very different place than it is today. Now, there's a little tiny bit of resurgence right now. Unions getting a foothold in some areas where they haven't had a foothold in the past. But the agency has gone from having more than 400 employees to down to somewhere in the ballpark of 200 employees. So it's half the size of what it used to be. But it's also doing a lot of different work than it did in its early days. It only focused on labor relations, mostly in the private sector, back in the day at FMCS. I think the future of FMCS is to continue to do that work. It's important work, and major labor disputes really impact on interstate commerce in this country, and our top-notch mediators can really help the parties work things out and get a deal. So one example of the impact FMCS has was the Bath Iron Works strike that happened near the end of the time I was the director of the agency. I actually get involved in that case. The president asked me to go up to Maine to help resolve the dispute with 4,500 employees laid off in a small state like Maine has major impact. On top of that, it was a shipyard that builds our warships, and those warships are needed. And there was no work being done. Employees were not getting paid. Went up there, worked with labor and management, IEM and AW, and the management of Bath Iron Works, and eventually got a deal. They were out for a good month and a half before they actually went back to work and started to get those warships back online, ready to go. And that's the impact FMCS has. We have a lot of super mediators who play that role throughout the nation, involved in major labor disputes that truly impact interstate commerce, our national defense. So our agency is very important, and it's a role that truly needs to continue to be there. Now, where we go in the future, I think FMCS becomes a dispute resolution agency, not only focusing on labor relations, but also on ADR. And that brings up another interesting topic. The whole, why did you move from being pretty much a labor relations agency to an agency involved in other areas of dispute resolution? Well, I think the best way to put that is it was thrust upon FMCS. Congress passed the Administrative Dispute Resolution Act and said, FMCS, you do that mediation thing. Why don't you kind of take the lead when it comes to dispute resolution in the federal sector? All federal agencies were asked to set up ADR programs. FMCS was put in a role of basically training folks in dispute resolution techniques. Now, the real question at the time, and I know this because of the benefit of looking through all of Jerry's papers and the history of FMCS, that FMCS at the time was a little reluctant to get into that world. They were fine with kind of training people on how to do dispute resolution employment matters in the federal sector, but really didn't want to be the mediators. They wanted to stay kind of on the labor relations side. And I know that from reading some of the papers from some of the former directors. They thought it was a little bit out of FMCS's lane. I think, in my view, in retrospect, that was a mistake. I think FMCS could have played a much more significant role in dispute resolution throughout government if they were a little more energetic about their response to the Administrative Dispute Resolution Act in its early days. Again, I understand it. All of our mediators came from the labor relations world, either former union, former management advocates, so it was a little bit of an uncomfortable fit initially. And there were some battles internally within FMCS that I read about on, how deep we should go into the non-labor relations dispute resolution work. As it turns out, we do a lot of that work at FMCS to this very day. We not only handle employment disputes at federal agencies, regardless of whether they're unionized or non-unionized. We also do a lot of work involving interagency disputes, disputes involving regulatory rulemaking, trying to avoid litigation when, for example, Department of Transportation wants to make a regulation change. We bring shareholders together, trying to avoid potential litigation and reach some form of consensus on regulations before they become, final and published in the Federal Register. So we're doing more and more of that work, and I think FMCS has individuals who are qualified to do that work. We're training them to do more and more of that work at FMCS. I continue to say we. I'm a former FMCS employee, no longer there, but I stay very close to the agency because of my role in the foundation. But the reality is, I think the agency is moving towards the future, which might have, less of a labor responsibility, still important, but more of a responsibility in dispute resolution in general in government. So I think that's the future of FMCS. Will it ever be a 400-person agency again? I don't know. I guess time will tell.
Well, speaking of that, how is that received from the labor and management side, that FMCS, the aperture of what they're doing appears to be broadening? How is that being received?
Well, I mean, it's mixed, in all honesty. I mean, obviously, our labor management customers want us to focus on them. Our federal sector customers that we're working with want us to focus on them. So, there's this balancing act that goes on in running an agency like FMCS and where you put your resources. And it also really impacts on who you hire. Do you hire the former labor representative who's only worked for the Teamsters for the last 20 years to be a federal mediator? Do you hire a federal sector person who's been involved in ADR for 20 years? Do you bring them in? When you bring them in, they need to learn the labor relations side. When you bring in the former union official, they need to learn the dispute resolution side, all the techniques associated with mediation and the like. So it's an interesting balance, and it's difficult. It's difficult for the leadership of FMCS to decide where to go. And I think, our customers eventually will tell us where we need to go. And I think we're still kind of early in that transition of where it's all going. I do know that when we first started to do it, my fellow commissioners, because I was part of the commissioner cadre out there, they were very upset about it because it was a change in what they knew. And as a matter of fact, it upset them so much in the early days of FMCS that they started a union movement. They wanted to actually unionize the mediator workforce. Now, I was relatively new, and somebody actually handed me a card to sign, an interest card to join the union. And I actually turned to that individual and I said, isn't our role as a neutral going to create some issues if we're actually unionized? And I was called down for even saying that from that individual. But as it turns out, the group that did get a showing of interest actually went to the Federal Labor Relations Authority. The Federal Labor Relations Authority said it would be inappropriate for FMCS to have a union at the time. And as a matter of fact, there's been another unionizing effort since then, and that was also turned away by the FLRA. But again, that gives you a little history of kind of how the agency is changed, and it's hit some bumpy roads over time. Some of the employees were not always on board with those kinds of changes, and change is hard. And when it comes to FMCS, moving from a labor relations agency to a dispute resolution agency, which is how I kind of see it right now, has been a difficult road. And I think one of the ways to really to deal with those issues right now is to hire people who are open to both worlds and not just locked into one or the other.
Well, you mentioned FLRA. How does FMCS work with other federal agencies?
Well, I think it's important. FMCS plays a key role in the federal sector because in the federal sector, if there's a labor dispute between labor and management and they can't agree on contract language, they are required to come to FMCS for mediation. If mediation is unsuccessful, then they go to the impasses panel, which is a part of the Federal Labor Relations Authority. And the impasses panel kind of act as arbitrators and make a final decision on contract language. The two worlds, FMCS and the Federal Service Impasses Panel, have started to work better together. It's one of the things I did when I was director is I actually invited the FSIP chairman to come in and talk about how we can work better together, because you can't work in isolation. They need to know what we're doing, and we need to know what they need when it goes to the impasses panel. How many issues do you want to end up on your plate if we can't help the parties get a deal? If we send a contract that still has 12 issues, are you going to send it back to us? We work those things out. And FMCS and FSIP now, for example, work very closely together to help the parties work out their own deal. And it keeps FSIP from having to actually issue decisions. So it's a good thing for us to work together. We also work with the FLRA in helping them resolve disputes involving negotiability in the federal sector. There's a lot of issues that are non-negotiable in the federal sector which are negotiable in the private sector. When those issues come up and management says those are non-negotiable, it leads to a negotiability appeal, which is a legal matter that the FLRA has to decide upon. FMCS has been asked to play the role of mediator in those cases so they don't have to adjudicate them if it can be worked out between the parties. So we've played a more active role in that area with the FLRA. And we're working with the MSPB, the Merit Systems Protection Board. We've done that for years, helping them mediate some of their cases so they don't have to adjudicate all of them. So we're working closer with other federal government agencies on many fronts.
So you talked about how FMCS works with other federal agencies. Primarily they work with private companies and unions. How does that happen? How does the activity of a mediator impact those labor relations?
That's very interesting, and it kind of shows the value of FMCS. Basically, in the private sector, the parties, labor and management, do not have to use FMCS. There's no requirement. All they have to do is notify us that they are engaging in collective bargaining. Then it's the mediator's role to contact the parties and say, hey, we're FMCS. We're available to you if you hit a roadblock in negotiations. We would love to help you out if you think that you need us. Now, the reality is, if they decide they don't want to use FMCS, there is nothing in the world that FMCS can do to intervene in negotiations unless the strike or lockout that is occurring impacts our nation's health or safety. And that rarely happens. I think in the last 25 years, we may have invoked the Taft-Hartley provision that said we can get involved and they have to accept our mediation. And one was the ports dispute in, I believe that was sometime in the early 2000s. And that was because shipments couldn't get out, the ports were closed on the West Coast. Shipments couldn't get out to Hawaii. Baby formula and drugs were on those ships. There was also some military conflicts going on, and that shipping also impacted that. So the health and safety of our nation was impacted. So we did intervene in that case. But in general terms, FMCS has no authority to intervene in any labor dispute. So how do we get involved? You hear about FMCS getting involved in a lot of major cases. It's the mediator's role to basically sell the importance of a third-party neutral that's not being paid by either side to come in with lots of experience in collective bargaining and labor relations to help them work their dispute out. It takes a lot of work from some mediators to get into a case because one side or the other may be reluctant to have a third party in the mix. They may feel that the power balance is in their favor. So why would they bring in somebody like a referee? So it's a tough sell for FMCS on occasion to get involved in cases. And the skills of the mediator as a salesperson for what we can add to the process really makes a difference. A lot also has to do with the reputation of the mediators that industry and or union has dealt with in the past. There are certain industries where FMCS is involved in almost all of their labor disputes. One example is the music industry. I had the real privilege of learning an awful lot about the orchestra business, the symphony business, because I got involved in the Pittsburgh Symphony Orchestra strike, the Fort Worth orchestra strike, the Pittsburgh Symphony Orchestra strike, the Atlanta lockout at the Symphony Orchestra. Those folks are amazing when it comes to collective bargaining. They're relatively small bargaining units. The symphonies have anywhere between 80 and about 120 players, and they're all unionized, mostly from the American Federation of Musicians. And then the management side, they're also all former musicians, people who love the arts. And when you get involved in some of those labor disputes, oh my goodness, the passion in the room is immense.
Well, you said once you're in the room, once the mediator sold their services and they're accepted by both parties, what's it like being a mediator in those rooms?
It can be very difficult because both sides expect you to kind of become their advocate. You know, one of the things we do, generally the way a mediation session works is you meet with both sides together first. You introduce yourself. You talk about what FMCS can do and what we can't do. And then we tell both sides to tell their story about why they're stuck in negotiations right now. And then you go in separate caucus with each side. And then that's when you really hear about what's going on. The union will tell you, you know, those management people are doing this and that and this and that. And we can't believe this and that's so unfair. Don't you think so? Can you go in that room and convince them to stop doing whatever they're doing or give us more money or give us more benefits? And I can't believe we haven't already sold you. You're going to be our advocate in that other room. You're going to get them to change their mind, right? And as a mediator, it can be difficult because you're listening. You're you know, and I have to be very honest about this. Sometimes either side's telling a really strong story and you believe it, but you can't go, yep, you're right. I'm going to go in there and get them to change their mind. That's not our role. Our role is to listen, understand the dispute, and try to maybe make a suggestion or two on how to get closer together. So it can be very difficult when you get in a room. I'll never, when I talked about the passion involved in negotiations. There was a bassoonist, a female bassoonist, who I was having a discussion with the union side of the equation. I won't say which symphony it was from. And you know, I talked about I worked in shipyards also. This female bassoonist cussed me out like no shipyarder has ever cussed me out in my life and told me to go in that other room and tell those, and the expletives went on for a very long time, to get off their wage offer and give them a better living wage, or she was going to my tookus, you know, she was going to take care of me. So it was quite emotional. And you know, mediators have to listen to a lot of that. And the key to being a good, solid mediator is not letting any of that affect that, listening, take it all in, and then going out in the hallway and taking a deep breath and being glad you weren't hit by the bassoon, because I thought she was going to come at me with the bassoon itself. So, you know, it's a tough role to play. You know, and the other room is just as passionate about what they do and what they need to do to keep the business running. So it's a difficult job. Long nights, a lot of work associated with working with the parties and calling other mediators who have handled similar cases and how they've resolved, doing some, you know, your own research on what, you know, the norms are for that community. So it is very tough work to be a mediator out in the field in symphony cases, shipyard cases, again. And the cool part about being an FMCS mediator is you do it all. You don't, you know, one day you're at the symphony, next day you're with the shipyard, next day you're at the nuclear test site facility in Nevada. You know, it's amazing the scope and breadth of the work we do and the impact it has. Now you might say, symphony work, I mean, that only affects 100, you know, employees technically. Yes, but an entire community pines for that music, and it becomes front-page news in places like Atlanta or Pittsburgh. Shipyards, while the numbers are bigger, Newport News Shipbuilding and Dry Dock, which I work with an awful lot. Again, we were talking earlier about do you get involved in a lot of private sector cases? Newport News Shipbuilding and Dry Dock Company and FMCS have had a long relationship along with the United Steelworkers of America to help them with their 4 unions work things out so they don't have ugly labor disputes. In the early 2000s, they had a 100-day strike at Newport News Shipbuilding and Dry Dock Company. We eventually helped them work that out, but ever since, they really haven't had a strike or a lockout for those 20,000 plus employees who build our aircraft carriers at Newport News Shipbuilding and Dry Dock Company. And most of those employees are represented by the United Steelworkers Local 8888. And, you know, I had the pleasure of working with them, all 4 unions there, the firefighters union, the guard union, and the radiological control technicians union, and they haven't had any labor disputes since then. And again, that impacts on our national security. So the work is just really interesting. Now, are there some industries where we don't get involved? Unfortunately, yes. Some industries have not maybe had the best experience in the past in mediation. You know, is that, you know, can we convince them that, you know, we'll do better? FMCS does have a new cadre of people. We have turned over the years. The United Auto Workers and the automobile industry, the major automobile manufacturers, have not had a lot of history with FMCS, where it has been the norm for FMCS to get involved in labor disputes. Some of the former leadership, I think a lot of these folks have turned over since then, saw bringing in mediation as a weakness in their position for their bargaining unit. To show, you know, and, you know, we do everything in our power to help the parties understand that it doesn't impact it doesn't really indicate weakness from either side. But again, we have a tough time getting involved in auto industry cases, and I'd like to see that change in the future. I hope the auto industry and the United Auto Workers, you know, see more value in FMCS in the future.
Why is FMCS history important?
Well, you know, I think dispute resolution's history in general is important. And the place it really was formalized was in collective bargaining, in labor relations, starting way back in 1918 at the Department of Labor, where this cadre of commissioners were put together to basically be the first formalized government dispute resolution professionals. It's a business that's grown exponentially over the years. Kind of the birthplace for dispute resolution in government was with FMCS. So I think it's important to write the history of where all this came about. There are now just thousands and thousands of people who claim that they are mediators. There are very few who are full-time professional mediators who earn a full paycheck doing that for a living, and they are housed right at FMCS. It's important for everybody to know where all that came from, where it started. And it's an interesting history with some twists and turns in it.
If you had unlimited resources, if you had the ability to make any sort of changes at FMCS, what would you do to make FMCS even better?
Well, I think I'd start by really taking a good look at how we hire people at FMCS. I think just like the certain agencies that deal with kind of the banking industries have kind of a special pay rate where they can bring in some of the top professionals from the banking industry to regulate the banking industry. I think some of the top professionals in collective bargaining would make for great mediators. Some of the top professionals in dispute resolution that are out there right now, folks who write books about it, like Getting to Yes, the Roger Fishers of the world, that crew from Harvard Negotiations Project. It'd be great for them to be on FMCS's staff. But the only way to get those kinds of people would be to bring them in at a pay rate that FMCS can't even dream of right now. You'd almost need special pay rates for those positions. So if I had, you know, the wish list of an unlimited budget, I'd want to be one of those agencies that could pay people really for the value of the work they do. And FMCS could really use some of those very top mediators and professionals in the collective bargaining world. I think that would make a big difference. But again, FMCS has a tiny budget when it comes to, resources, and somewhere in the ballpark of $55 million or somewhere around there. It's hard to hire people at that rate. But that's what I would do. And I'd also, focus on it becoming a dispute resolution agency that can do a lot more to help, the negotiated rulemaking side, the ADR side, and really be kind of house a training entity for this nation for dispute resolution skills and technology associated with it. But that's, we never had the resources to do that kind of thing.
How would you explain to the average person on the street why their tax dollars go to FMCS? What benefit does this bring?
I truly believe when you look at the math that when we resolve a case like Bath Iron Works or a Symphony dispute or a dispute that may happen at Newport News, or let's talk about the sexy ones, a Major League Baseball strike or lockout. Incidentally, where FMCS did not get involved in this time around. One side said they didn't want to utilize mediation, but we have been involved in the past in a number of sports disputes. It impacts on our nation. It truly does. People want to see their baseball. They want to see their hockey. We resolved the big hockey lockout that went on a number of years ago. It impacts their everyday lives. But more importantly than that kind of thing, our national defense is key. We truly have to have those shipyards cranking out aircraft carriers. That matters. We need our automobile manufacturers to get those cars out there so people can buy them. That matters in our economy. The shipping of materials from our ports, that matters. We've always been involved in the ports negotiations, both on the East Coast and the West Coast. They matter. Your groceries. Grocery disputes happen all the time. You want to be able to get your groceries. FMCS helps get those employees back to work, those employers working with those employees to give them benefits that make them want to go back to work and serve the public. So we do play a role. When you really look at the bang for the buck, I think FMCS is tax dollars spent well.
If you could pick any job in the agency, what job would you pick and why?
Honestly, the job I loved the most was being a commissioner in the field. I had no supervisory responsibilities. All I had to deal with was the parties, and being a peacemaker out there in the community was a wonderful experience. You don't always make the paper, you don't get the headline news, because once the parties get a deal, you kind of get out of the room. You let them, talk about how they got the deal and how it all worked out. Sometimes they don't even mention mediation was involved. But I know that the role that FMCS played in that deal was important, and it mattered, and I did something to help them get a deal. That makes you sleep better at night. You feel good about yourself. You find out a lot about a lot of different industries. Every industry impacts little tiny bits of our economy throughout the nation. They're all interweaved. If one organization goes on strike, it impacts another organization because that's where they get their supplies. So it truly is all interconnected. But yeah, the mediator job is the best job in the agency.
Can you give us some examples of international projects that you were involved in?
The international job had its benefits. I loved it. Got to see places I had never dreamed I would see in my life. I had the opportunity to go to Myanmar to help them when they became a democracy, which wasn't that long ago. It was about 2015, 2014. They became a democracy. We were teaching them labor relations techniques, arbitration techniques, and mediation techniques for their newly established labor department. Unfortunately, that didn't take, because Myanmar now is back under military control and didn't work out so well. But just learning about, their evolution into a democracy and now kind of back out of a democracy was kind of an interesting experience. And that's what FMCS can do. We did that work in connection with the International Labor Organization, again, trying to protect employees. And the other thing was seeing, conditions in those kinds of locations, and how the workers are not necessarily treated the best way. You really felt like, the work we were doing was going to impact and change some of the lives that you saw, which were pretty desperate in nations like Myanmar. And that also made me feel very good about the work we did and the work I had the opportunity to do at FMCS.
Can you talk about what a commissioner is and where that term comes from?
It's also an interesting story dating way back to the time when all of the mediators worked for the Department of Labor. When they decided to break out the Federal Mediation and Conciliation Service in conjunction with the Taft-Hartley Act from the Department of Labor into an independent agency, they had to figure out what to call the mediators. They also had to figure out what to call the agency. It's called the Federal Mediation and Conciliation Service. One would think, why not just call it the Federal Mediation Service? Well, the history of all of the 50 or so conciliators, and that's the term they had, they were called commissioners, and they used the term conciliation back then. They decided to go ahead and take that term and move it forward into FMCS. The term commissioner sometimes is debated. Some mediators like to be called commissioner when they're working with the parties. Some of the parties like to call us commissioners. Others think it's an unnecessary title and not necessary at all. But the history of it comes from the early days of the Department of Labor. In general terms at FMCS, while we give a commissioner certificate when you become a new mediator and you actually get a credential that says commissioner, in general, we call ourselves mediators in the agency, and that's kind of the more accepted terminology. But that's the history behind it. It was just a matter of how do you take this from this agency, turn it into an independent agency, and those folks wanted to keep the title of commissioner when the transition occurred, and it's stuck to this day.
How does FMCS get involved with public sector bargaining?
That's also very interesting. I mentioned earlier the bulk of our work is in the private sector covered by the Taft-Hartley Act. I also mentioned that we do work in the federal sector. By law, we are required to resolve disputes between labor and management in collective bargaining agreements in the federal sector. But in the public sector, the 50 states and their state employees and their local employees, that is as different as every state. In some states, we're written right into their legislation that we are their mediation service. In other states, they have their own independent mediation service. In another set of states, we work side by side with their mediators, with state-appointed mediators. So it's all over the board. For example, one of the disputes that occurred during my time as a leader of the agency was a major teachers dispute in Denver, Colorado. We were called to get involved in that. The statute in Colorado allowed us to do that, so we came in and worked with the parties. What was really interesting about that labor dispute, it all turned out well. We were able to help the parties work a deal out. But what was interesting about that labor dispute was that their labor statute for the state and local employees required that all negotiations be done in the sunshine, which meant the public could attend the negotiations. The public could see the negotiations. They were actually being filmed. That was a unique situation for FMCS because we're not used to working with the parties in a public, televised kind of setting. a lot of things we have to say sometimes are not always fit for cameras, let's put it that way, and confidentiality. Now, when the parties go into separate rooms, they did not have to literally have the cameras rolling, but it was a unique change for our mediator. It can be very difficult to do a case when you're actually being filmed and going through your techniques. So that was kind of unique. That was a public sector case. We have strikes all over the country. In Chicago, we're written into their labor statute. We get involved in those cases when the parties request our services, and we've had a long history of success in working with the parties in the public sector. Again, that's where FMCS's impact truly comes home to the taxpayer. Getting teachers back in the classrooms, also getting teachers paid a fair wage is all part of what we're about. Getting in there so those kind of labor disputes won't last forever, and your children will be able to go back to the classroom and learn what they need to learn for our economy and our society. So we play a role even in that world. Some states have police and firefighter bargaining, others they don't. In cases in the states where they have that, we get involved in those cases. But again, what's unique about being an FMCS mediator is you not only have to understand private sector labor relations and how that works and what the labor statute talks about, you need to understand the federal sector because you get federal sector cases also, and you get state and local government cases depending on where you're located. So our mediators have to be a jack of a number of trades and labor statutes.
What's it like to be a mediator? What do you hear at the bargaining table, and how do parties interact with each other? That must be really difficult being a mediator, hearing both sides of it.
It is. The key to the beginning of a mediation session is to, one, make sure they understand your role. A lot of folks don't understand our role. Even folks who are professionals in the collective bargaining world, see our role differently than we see our role in the way we're written into the statute. The reality is we have no authority to make anybody do anything. So our role is to work with the parties and to persuade them to reach a joint settlement. It's not an easy job. When we get involved, generally there's a lot of emotion on both sides of the equation, especially if we come in during a strike or a lockout, or if you're coming in when both sides are chanting that they're either going to lock out or strike real soon. And that's generally when FMCS gets in the mix. We hope to get in earlier, but most of the time that's when we get involved in the negotiations. So what we try to do is make sure they understand our role, that we're not decision makers. Our role is to help persuade them to reach a joint settlement. Now, how do we go about doing that? Obviously, we have to build trust with the parties. Sometimes with the experience of many years of dealing with the parties, I worked in the Virginia area for a number of years, so I had 3 or 4 successive contract negotiations with some of the parties I dealt with. So they were very comfortable with me. They trusted me. They knew my role, and they knew what I could do to help them out. That's a positive thing. Newer mediators, it's a little more difficult for them because they have to come in and hopefully ride on the shoulders of the mediators who were there before them. Sometimes they expect the same kind of person, and in all honesty, we have some 150 mediators throughout the nation. There's 150 different mediation styles out there because everybody brings their own style to the table. So the parties have different expectations that way. So the reality is you have to get the parties relatively comfortable with you. And that can be difficult. There's a lot of folks who misunderstand our role as government employees. Well, you're from the government. Does that mean you currently work for the current administration? No, our mediators are apolitical. They play no role in the political world. They're not appointed. They are career civil servants who have no political connections. Now, when I was appointed by the president, obviously I was a political appointee, but that's the only political appointment from the entire agency is the director of the agency. And I had to explain that to many parties, because depending on what party it happened to be, one side or the other tends to lean one way or the other. They immediately say, oh, you're from the government, you're representing the administration. And the answer is no, not when the mediator's at the table. Okay? Even when I was asked to get involved in the dispute, the Bath Iron Works, from the president, as the director of the agency, I told him my role was to be a neutral here and work with both sides. My goal is for the parties to reach a voluntary settlement you can both live with. And they understood that, and they let me work with them for 7 consecutive days and accepted the fact that I was a trusted neutral with a lot of history and knew what I was doing. So job 1 is to gain the trust of the parties. And then be a good listener. In all honesty, when negotiations break down, both sides tend to stop listening to each other. So you become the ears of both sides, and you listen in separate caucus with what they're saying. And a lot of times when you go in the other room and you ask the other side, what do you think their issues are that's causing this dispute not to move on, not to get resolved? A lot of times the other side of the table doesn't truly understand what the other side is truly focusing on. You could help them focus on where the disagreement is. Because in negotiations, there's a lot of extraneous stuff. There could be 20 articles on the table still that are not agreed to. But your job as a mediator is to focus on where's the real problem here and find that, and then get the parties to work that out. Everything else tends to fall in place. But until you really say, listen, here's the real problem we need to address, you help focus them. Now again, there's no mediation dust you can throw in the air and make it all get better. I mean, sometimes a strike or a lockout has to happen. But the reality is our job is to minimize that, to make sure the parties truly understand where the other side's coming from. And sometimes they can't say that to the other side. Sometimes the role of the mediator is to say, hey, what message do you need me to send across the table that you can't say at the table? That's the key part of what we do and how we do it. And delivering that message clearly can be very difficult because, again, you don't want to give them the wrong impression. You don't want to sell a bill of goods that might not be, agreeable across the table. I can tell you a number of times where I had one side say, if you can just get them to agree to this, we got a deal, and I'll bring that message over, and I'll come back and say they're good with that, and then they go, well, yeah, but we'd also like, I go, no, you got to tell me exactly, I can't go back there after you told me that. So you have to get them to be honest, open, and trust you to take that information across the table. You also you better be a pretty good deliverer of a message. You don't want to garble that message because that could make it even worse. So you have to be very careful as a mediator.
So most people don't get to see negotiations. What's it like actually being in the room mediating both sides?
You hear a lot of emotion. I mean, this stuff affects people's lives on both sides of the collective bargaining table. I've seen bargaining lead to folks on the management side lose their jobs. I've seen it lead to companies shutting down. I've seen it lead to employees taking pay cuts. I've seen everything happen in collective bargaining. So this really does affect people. And I never lost focus of that, and our mediators don't lose focus of that when I'm at the collective bargaining table. This is important stuff. This affects people's lives. It affects our national economy. So it's important. And it is so important that people do lose their patience. They do lose their temper. They do literally break out in fistfights. People don't see that kind of thing. That still happens in collective bargaining. You'll never hear a mediator talk about that, about a specific case, but I have broken up a number of fights in my day, physical fights. I have literally stood between the parties and not intentionally, but had them bump into me. And I've literally had people get ready to step up and walk out of the room, and I've had to stand up and say, sit down and block the door. This is too important to walk out of the room. Let's work it out. So, you know, it requires all kinds of skills like that. It requires the ability to calm people down when they get very upset and saying the right thing. You know, you don't say, oh, calm down, because that tends to piss people off even more than they are already. But, you know, you need to control the room. I mean, sometimes it's literally, I mean, when people are bickering across the table and I can't get anybody to focus, I've literally slammed the table like that. And immediately it's like throwing up, what do they call them, flashbangs in a room where everybody goes, oh my God, this guy's serious about us being quiet and listening to each other. I mean, there's a lot of different techniques depending on the environment you're in. But the negotiating rooms can be very pleasant, and parties can work things out and listen to your suggestions. Other times, you know, you feel like you're literally walking in the middle of a war zone. And, you know, that's actually the real interest in being a mediator is every day was very different in that regard.
What does a mediator do if a company goes on strike? How do they continue? How do they help both parties get to a resolution, or do they?
Well, a lot of times, you know, if the union decides to go out on strike, you know, they'll notify us, obviously, and they'll say, you know, we'll go back to the table. We don't plan on going back to the table for a couple weeks at the minimum. We go, okay, you know, we don't get involved in internal strategy. We may say, you know, do you think that management's view will change after 2 weeks? And they may say, well, yes, we do, because that's why we're doing this. We believe that without production, it's going to impact them, and they're going to see the seriousness of our position. Same thing for a lockout. You know, I may say, what will a 2-week strike lead to? Why do you think that's going to have a positive effect? A lot of times, emotion gets involved with, let's go out on strike, let's show them. But you know, the mediator's role is to say, well, let's think about this. I mean, you have the right to go out on strike, that's fine. But what's the impact of it? Why do you think it's going to be successful? Why do you think it's going to bring a solution to this problem to the table? Sometimes they have a very good answer, sometimes they don't. If they don't have a good answer, a mediator's role is to say, you might want to think twice about doing that.
Well, FMCS is a non-political agency. However, it's a member of the executive branch. Have you seen a difference between different administrations and then the activities of FMCS?
Well, I think the role of FMCS being neutral has always been in the forefront of every director who's been appointed by Republican or Democratic administrations. Very rarely does an internal person become the director of the agency. It's only happened 3 times in the history of the agency. I was the 19th director, so it's not the norm. So generally, the people who become directors are more politically connected. But that being said, they never lose the fact that we need to be neutral. Now, how we work with the parties, again, at the field level, really never changes regardless of Democratic or Republican administration. There may be some different perspectives on the role of FMCS in being a neutral and helping with a card count for a union election. Republican appointees tend to think that that's probably being too close to unions. Democratic employees, Democratic administrations want FMCS to do that more often. But that's a policy decision that's made at a higher level, and it really doesn't get involved in the collective bargaining. We're never told sway the negotiation one way or the other. I've looked through all the history papers that Jerry have collected for years. There's no indication that FMCS has ever kind of been at the table working with the parties, pushing an agenda. That's not what we do. The minute we do that, in the private sector, they will reject us and never use us again. So I think that's why FMCS would never go there. I mean, we're a neutral agency. We're non-regulatory. We're non-adjudicative. We simply play the role of being kind of everybody's friend and nobody's enemy, and our role is to help both sides get a deal.
You've seen the history of FMCS in many papers and things that are at the National Archives. What have you learned from those papers, and what's actually in those papers?
It is interesting. Jerry's collection is over 250 boxes of things. Now, some of it, it's all over the board. Some of it's conference materials that we've had from training mediators. It's hats and bags from conferences. It's also some policy papers that were put together internally, some that can be found at NARA, some that were not at NARA. NARA didn't kind of exist when a lot of these papers were put together. It's interesting to note that FMCS's history has really been on a pretty straight trajectory about our basic mission. Directors come and go, but the general work of the agency really hasn't changed much, other than morphing a little more into a dispute resolution agency than being a labor relations agency. We're all about being the neutral kid on the block who can help you out. And we're really the one agency who truly could say, we're from the government, we're here to help, because we can't regulate, we can't adjudicate. So, we can honestly say that. The history of the agency shows that when you go through all the papers. You see how proud the agency is of their work when you look through all of the history papers. It's a tight-knit community of mediators. The terminology that was used when I first came on board with the agency is we're all kind of a family. And when it comes to the mediator corps, we were hired in classes. So my class, there were 20-some mediators. We all stayed in touch with each other, went through extensive training. When I had a case where, I was dealing with a very difficult client on either side of the collective bargaining table, I would call some of my classmates and we would chat about, this is the fix I'm in. How can I give them a suggestion which might move them? So it's a close-knit community. Anytime anybody ever gets sick, the agency steps up and people volunteer to give, shared sick leave and things like that. I've never seen that in any other agency like it happens at FMCS. It's a close group of people who take their work very, very seriously. And it's commendable. And you see it all through the history of the agency.
You said Friends of FMCS has 200 boxes of papers. Can you talk about what some of the papers are?
Yes, I mean there was one box that I looked through that went through the evolution of the 3 attempts to unionize at FMCS. I was really interested in that, so I read through it. Again, there were when change occurs, that kind of movement kind of popped up. So I read some of the documents associated with that, and again, it was interesting to read because the folks who were trying to create, the union environment at FMCS for the commissioners, they were cautious about trying to protect their neutrality and still make that happen. So there was a lot of debate there and how that worked out. Those are very interesting papers. Again, the evolution of ADR, alternative dispute resolution, which was really kind of a completely different animal. It wasn't labor relations work. As a matter of fact, some people saw it as almost competing with labor relations work because unions and management have to work together. If we're doing ADR in non-union environments, that was a mortal sin, especially because most of our mediators had come from the union side of the equation. So there was a lot of pushback on that. Again, most of that work is only in the federal sector, but still, it was work we were doing, and it had nothing to do with unionization or collective bargaining. So again, there was some pushback from leadership and from employees, and you can read some of those documents in some of those boxes. Just the difference in kind of the formality of how things ran in the early days of FMCS when it was a much larger organization. We had at one point 12 regional offices. The mediators at one time all had administrative assistants assigned to them. It's evolved so much over the years. Now a mediator's given a laptop, and you type your own stuff, you turn on your own reports. There's no administrative help other than one for an entire area of the country. So, the documents kind of show how all that happened over the years, and that's also very interesting to read.
How difficult is it to lead an agency that is filled with labor relations specialists? That has to be difficult.
Well, yeah, everybody who ends up becoming a commissioner or our agency at one time was an advocate for one side or the other. And they like to continue their advocacy work sometimes. They become, whether or not we're not a unionized organization with the exception of the clerical staff in a national office. But the mediators, they know how to fight for themselves. And they're not shrinking violets. So whenever you wanted to institute a change, we heard from them. And as a matter of fact, in the spirit of trying to deal with some of their concerns, during the John Calhoun Wells directorship, a unionization effort cropped up. Again, I mentioned the FLRA decided that it was inappropriate for FMCS to have a union representing the commissioners, but John Calhoun Wells allowed for a partnership group, they called it. Those meetings still occur. It's under a different name, and they're basically representatives of the mediators, and it's kind of their voice back to senior management of the agency. And they do quite a good job of advocating for what they want to see in dealing with working conditions and things like that. So they're a pretty vocal group. Most of their concerns are legitimate. When I was the director, we tried to address them. They came up with some ideas that I absolutely agreed with. Came up with some ideas that we could not live with for budgetary reasons or whatever. But if we as an agency, we as a leadership of an agency can't listen to an agency that's job is basically to listen, then we're not doing our job. So dealing with our mediators was both a pleasure and sometimes a challenge.
What's it like to be in a negotiation where it's primarily wages? If there's a wage dispute, what does a mediator go through?
Well, that's interesting. Obviously, people see their worth the way they want to see their worth, and a company sees their worth the way they want to see their worth, and it can be a real ugly battle. Sometimes the number is extremely different, and there's a chasm between there that you just feel will never be taken care of. One of the ways I would approach a case, or most of our mediators approach a case, would be, okay, let's be optimistic about this. And let's try not to only think about the number, but let's think about other ways we can bridge the potential gap. In other words, this chasm is a potential possibility for a unique solution. And I try to get them to maybe think a little bit out of the box when it comes to wages. Is there other ways to address the wage issue? Sometimes you're just focused on the numbers and you have to deal with those numbers. The way a mediator normally deals with that is to try to deal with the appropriate standard, the comparative standard. What is most appropriate to compare these wages to? There's industry-wide bargaining that goes on, so you can look at other industries, similar companies. What are they paying their employees? But then when you start to make those arguments and you start to look at those figures, there's all kinds of reasons why someone will say, yes, but that comparison is inappropriate because what they do is just a little different from what we do. Classic example of that, again, is I was talking about the orchestras and symphony business. The symphonies actually have an organization where they print the salary levels and benefit levels of all of their key symphonies. It's a union-based kind of spreadsheet. And, I used to always have that. So when I was dealing with a symphony case, I would basically be able to compare, the Atlanta salaries to a Pittsburgh symphony salary to Metropolitan Symphony. All those symphonies are all listed there. And then we'd have a discussion on, why should you make more than them or they make more than you? What are we talking about there? So it kind of gets down to the standards. What's the appropriate standard to talk about? And what will be the impact of that wage increase? Also, will we be able to keep the employees? Will the employees for the company start to leave because of the wages? Will they go other places? Part of our job is to facilitate those discussions. This is hearing it from the other side of the table sometimes doesn't ring as true. And hearing it from a neutral who says, listen, I dealt with this other shipyard. I know for a fact that the wages that you're asking for are much lower or much higher than what I saw in a settlement there. And you can say those kinds of things. And that's how you help the parties get closer together. Again, unfortunately, a lot of times it takes a job action, a strike, or a lockout to get the other party to start truly listening one way or the other. But that's how we deal with it. I mean, it really comes down to doing your research as a mediator and helping the parties understand the appropriate standards that you're talking about. It's much more difficult in certain industries where things are unique, like the sports industries. That becomes a little more difficult. And a lot of times that's a match of wills. Who's going to hold out the longest? How long is the team going to, the team owners all going to stick it out versus, all the owners also have different interests because some small markets are not the same as the large markets when it comes to the money they have available to even throw in the pot. So, and on the players' side, for example, there's sometimes dissension within the union team on what a deal should look like when it comes to wages or the like. So, all that just depends on the circumstance. It's one thing about mediators. There is no formula on how to do this job. One of the questions we get asked when we train our new mediators is kind of give us a how to do it list. And there really isn't a how to do it list other than some basic rules. One, you must maintain confidentiality between the parties. You must keep all the information you get to yourself and not tell the press or anyone else. Our comment to the press is always talk to the parties. It's their negotiation. We're there to assist the parties, and that's all we're here to tell you. But the basic kind of what steps you go through and how you help bridge the gap in a labor dispute is really dependent on the situation you walk into. Whether, maybe they have all those standards and that route just isn't the way to go. And you start talking about, well, what's the impact of not getting a deal here? Will you start to lose employees? What's the job market look like for the area? You also have to do your research in that area. A labor dispute involving a shipyard in Hampton Roads in Southern Virginia, there are 10, 12 shipyards. Newport News is the largest, but there's a lot of smaller shipyards, and there's a federal sector shipyard there called Norfolk Naval Shipyard. So employees can move around to lots of different shipyards there. Bath, Maine, there's Bath Iron Works. Very different animal. And you talk about those different things, how that works. Where will you get a labor pool of people who can do that highly technical work? So that's how we bridge the gap. We do our homework. An example of how standards and kind of the environment you're working in comes into play is the shipyard environment. In Southern Virginia, where Newport News Shipbuilding is located, the Norfolk Naval Shipyard is located, and many other smaller private shipyards, there's a labor pool of folks in the metal trades who are highly skilled, who can move between all those different employers. That's very different than the environment in Maine where there's Bath Iron Works. That's the one shipbuilder up there. The ability to move around, to find additional welders, ship fitters, pattern makers, folks like that, in that kind of environment is very different than down in Hampton Roads. So in each case, you have to deal with it very differently and understand that and know that and be educated about what's in the community where the negotiations are going on. So that's a tough job for a mediator, and a mediator has to do that homework before they walk into a case.
What does breaking your pick mean?
That's an old term. When I first heard it at FMCS, I was kind of shocked by it. I don't, what's that about? Well, you know, the union world and the coal miners kind of come together in the early history of labor relations. So that terminology kind of comes from the coal mines. And breaking your pick means you make a mistake, which means you're unacceptable to the parties. So you either screw up when it comes to confidentiality by letting something slip to the other side, or just coming across too strong as an advocate for one side or the other when you're doing your mediation with the parties in separate caucus, or just become unacceptable for whatever reason it might be. The term the mediators use is you broke your pick. And the way FMCS deals with that is that we don't normally send that mediator, away. We bring in another mediator to work with that person and help him through the process or her through the process. So that's how we deal with a mediator who has broken their pick. But it's an interesting question. I haven't heard that term in a while, but it is used by the mediator workforce out there.
And then what does FMCS do to stop a labor dispute before it starts?
Well, what we do to help the parties not get into a situation where there's a strike or a lockout is we try to do preventive mediation. That means when we call the parties, we see that the contract is coming up for renegotiation, we try to encourage them to engage in some training with us on everything from basic labor relations to dispute resolution training to interest-based bargaining training, techniques on how to work better together, techniques on how to listen to the other side, techniques on dispute resolution. The parties come together. We only do that training in joint session with both sides. And we teach them the techniques of basically what we do, basically how to reach agreement up front instead of kind of doing it while they're in the process. We talk about all of the best practices for bargaining. We talk about even the law to some degree, without going into detail because we're not a regulatory agency. We can't, call the parties on a violation of law or anything like that. It's not our role. But sometimes just the understanding of what the parties can or can't do at the collective bargaining table is important. So we call that preventative mediation. The reality is some folks really appreciate that up front, and it's been very successful. We do a lot more of that in the public sector than we do in the private sector, even though we're doing more of that now than we have in the past. In the federal sector, we do an awful lot of it. Mostly it's interest-based bargaining training, kind of getting away from positional bargaining into what are your true interests, your underlying concerns, how can they be addressed in these collective bargaining agreements, as opposed to just coming in with extreme positions and then having to, compromise your way out of that paper bag to get a deal. So that training has become kind of a key element of FMCS, but it's also necessitated the need to train our mediators on being better trainers. Most of our mediators are former advocates. They understand the collective bargaining process very well, and they understand dispute resolution techniques. But when we first started doing a lot more preventive mediation, a lot of our folks said, that's not why I was hired. That's not my thing. And a lot of them left the agency. Now, this was in the early 90s, really during the John Calhoun Wells days of FMCS, when we started to get more into that. There were a lot of mediators who thought that was inappropriate for our agency, that we should not get involved until the fire breaks out, that we are really firefighters and we shouldn't be going into companies and unions and installing fire detection devices. But that's really what we're doing with preventive mediation. We're saying this is how you avoid the big fire. And it was received by the mediator workforce in a mixed way. Now it's just part of the business that we do. And most of our folks are top-notch when it comes to doing training and preventive mediation. And a lot of times, for all intents and purposes, we kind of put ourselves out of business because there's a lot less labor disputes, because I think we're doing a good job by training folks on how to do it better, so they don't end up in a ugly labor dispute.
If Director Ching, Director Herkin, Director Usry, Director Beck were in this room today, when you were the director, how has the agency changed?
Oh, you go back to Cyrus Ching's days, when, 1947, when the labor relations environment was very, very different. He probably had a much more labor relations focused perspective. Bill Usry, same thing, but the evolution started to happen with FMCS being identified as a dispute resolution agency that can help out government. When you get to Peter Herkin, Peter was a long-term management labor attorney, again, focusing on the labor side more than the ADR side, but he was very open to the ADR side and wanted to expand our business into that world, understood that in a shrinking union environment, that was something FMCS should look into and support, because Congress was saying it was something we should do. Allison took it to a new level. She also was very supportive of our international work, our ADR work, really thought that was the future, but also as a former general counsel for a labor organization, she also focused on the labor relations side of things, maybe a little more than I get credit for. I really saw my role is trying to deal with kind of the new world we live in, with unionization going down to somewhere in the single digits to 10% density in this country, and the agency shrinking from being 400 people to 200 people. We had to make some changes. The environment has changed, and I focused a little more on the ADR side, on the federal sector side, but never turning our backs on our traditional customers, on the private sector and the public sector that still need our help. There's just a little less need in those worlds because their numbers have dropped over time. I also believe that they would be shocked at how much online mediation we do now. All of them, including even Allison, who is just the director before my time as director. Shocked at, obviously, the pandemic throwing us into that world, but how successful we were at doing that, and how it's kind of turned out to be a thing. A lot of parties ask for it as opposed to face-to-face mediation. I still believe it's preferable to have face-to-face mediation, but there are situations where everybody can't be at the table. Having the mediators all schooled in Zoom meetings and how to do that, and how to bring somebody in, and how to put them in a separate caucus room on a Zoom page, makes all the difference in the world. And I'm sure Cyrus Ching never would have had that dream or that nightmare of, that kind of world that we currently live in. It's changing very fast, and I think federal agencies, including FMCS, have to deal with that. And I think, we did that. I give a lot of credit to the support staff, to you, Greg. I mean, you, as the chief operating officer when I was a director, you spearheaded a lot of those changes along with Javier Ramirez, and our agency's a different place because of it. And I don't think Cyrus Ching would recognize the place.